Hey, how are we doing, everybody, and welcome back into the SFS channel. My name's Gavin, and today I'm talking about 5 fantasy players, beginning here with it officially being fantasy playoff season, that I'm a bit worried about, I'm beginning to panic on, and I think are bad news if you happen to have these players on your roster. So hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully you avoided either having these players on your teams down the stretch of this season, were able to pull off a last-minute trade and move off of these options. However, due to recent production, maybe it's a scheduling issue, a usage rate or volume problem that's arose as of late, I've got reason for concern with, again, these 5 players who are typically thought of as fantasy studs that I think could lay some eggs down the stretch of the season and have some costly, underproductive performances. So, with that being said, strap in, get ready. Hopefully you guys don't have these players. Let's hit the intro and let's get into it. Alrighty, here we go. So the first player we're going to talk about in today's episode is James Robinson of the Jacksonville Jaguars. J-Rob has been, since week 2 when he really had his emergence and breakout for this season in this Jaguars offense, he as of late has really tapered off. Now, he was somebody that we initially, or not initially, because again, his initial breakout didn't come until about week 3, but he was someone who has been in the cusp of a fringe RB1 level player for much of this season, whether that's a fringe top 10 or top 12 asset, depending on your league size or how you assess James Robinson up until this point in the season. That's irrelevant at this point because he's starting to trend down lower and lower in my stages and tiers of RB2 level performers. Now, for my purposes, that's a top 24 level running back because I play in a lot of 12-team leagues, and that's the verbiage and terminology that we use here on the channel. I typically refer to RB1s as top 12 running backs, RB2s as those top 24 level players. In the last 2 weeks in particular here, things have gotten really muddy for James Robinson. The production, the volume has not been there, and there's a variety of reasons that the overall output has become so sporadic and so unreliable these last couple of games that I think could potentially continue to play a level of problematic issues for our lineups down the stretch and obviously now into fantasy playoff season. So the first and major red flag here is plain and simple Urban Meyer. His decision-making process as a head coach has not been beneficial for fantasy managers and owners of virtually anyone in this offense at parts of the time this season, especially early on in the season with J-Rob, and now in the most pivotal times for our lineups, he's flared up as a problem for James Robinson yet again. This offense has been underproductive this season. Trevor Lawrence has not lived up to expectations because I believe he hasn't been put in good circumstances to be a productive quarterback. Obviously, he was the first overall pick, has a lot of talent, but the situation is not there right now. James Robinson has also been dealing with not only getting benched 2 weeks ago for a good chunk of that game against the LA Rams, but he's been really reduced in the overall involvement he's had, again, from a volume perspective with the team because, A, their team's not very competitive. They are frequently out of position and forced to throw passes at a very large rate down the stretch of football games because they're trying to catch up. In garbage time, they're trying to hang with the opposing team, which in the example of the LA Rams, they fall down 37-7. That was the final score. You're not able to run the football in that circumstance because you're so far out of your hopeful game script that you are forced to do other things that you might not necessarily want to. So the main reasoning for James Robinson's benching and reduced role in this offense has been the fact that he had back-to-back games with a lost fumble. However, I think that that's still a silly reason for him to be hanging out on the bench. J-Rob is clearly one of the best players on this Jacksonville roster and specifically the offense, so he needs to touch the football. But in the last 2 weeks combined, he only has a total of 14 rushing attempts, again, in his last 2 weeks, and most notably, he had 6 carries for 4 yards against the Tennessee Titans this past week. So the last 3 games have been very unsatisfying for fantasy managers, and I'm afraid that this could continue into the stretch of this season. He's got Houston in Week 15. That matchup doesn't scare me. Week 16 against the Jets doesn't scare me either, but the main reason for concern that I continue to have with James Robinson down the stretch is Urban Meyer. How is he going to use J-Rob? The Jags only lost 20-0 this past week, and I don't mean to say that lightly as if that should be an accomplishment, but 20 points is still a better margin of defeat. Now, again, they didn't score a single point, so they're not moving the football. They're not being an effective team offensively, but that's a situation that's less extreme than the loss to the Rams was, and J-Rob still had a mere 6 carries. So I think they'll be a more competitive team in particular in the next 2 weeks. However, Week 17, which is championship week for a lot of your rosters out there, is against the New England Patriots. I expect a very brutal output in that contest. And again, with the climate of this Jacksonville locker room, the roster right now, there's been a lot of dissociation and frustration with veterans regarding Urban Meyer and how he approaches this team. I think that this could potentially be a very ugly finish to the year for a team that, again, is quarterbacked by a very talented player in Trevor Lawrence, who has more turnovers than touchdowns on the season. DK Metcalf, a star receiver now, who has had some very troubling performances as of late. So we all know the deal with Russell Wilson. He had the finger injury and then missed a good chunk of time. He's been back for 5 weeks now. So over a month of time since returning against the Green Bay Packers has eclipsed since obviously that injury finished being an issue that was costing Russell Wilson games. And DK Metcalf is having one of the least productive stretches of his NFL career. Forget the 2021 season. Since Russell Wilson has returned to the lineup, DK has not eclipsed 8 points in half PPR scoring. That's the typical metric we use for fantasy output here on the SFS channel. We try and stay really balanced between those of you who are playing full PPR and those of you down in standard leagues. 8 points has been the top level of output he's had in the last 5 games. He's had 60 or fewer yards in each of those contests, and you guessed it, no touchdowns over that stretch of time. Obviously, a 6-point play would likely put him over that 8-point margin just based off of the half point for the catch. And if the reception was 20 yards or more, you've already broken through that 8-point threshold. So no receiving touchdowns since Russell Wilson has come back. And he has another troubling factor here is he's seen 8 or more targets in 4 out of those 5 weeks. So he's getting a respectable and healthy level of target volume and target share here, but he's not producing with the looks he's getting. He has not come up big and made the plays when they've been asked of him. So that is a concern. The player who has stepped up to the plate and who has been very productive for the Seahawks offense is Tyler Lockett, who has 10.5 or more points 4 weeks in a row in half PPR scoring, and he's coming fresh off of an 142-yard performance and a touchdown against the Houston Texans this past week. So Tyler Lockett and Russell Wilson throughout their careers together have been very intertwined. They have a great chemistry together. They've made some of the most impressive plays in the end zone and showed us some really great awareness and some really fantastic highlights. That connection is proving strong here down the stretch of this season, and that is the hot quarterback and wide receiver duo for this team down the stretch. I'm worried that DK Metcalf's struggles may continue here, and those of you who own him right now still have a very talented player on your roster, but you have a talented player who's not producing or living up to those expectations. So I don't know if it's a practice thing, whether it's just force-feeding DK Metcalf the ball. I don't know what the solution is here, but over the past month plus, they have not figured out the problem, and they have not figured out how to get better moving forward down the stretch of the season. The positive here is Seattle is still in contention for the last playoff spot in the NFC. They're going to continue to try and win football games and get this thing right, but as of late, things have not looked very good in this offense for DK in particular. Aaron Jones here, my next star fantasy player that I have a lot of frustrations, concerns with, coming from a Green Bay Packer fan. So obviously, we're not biased here. I don't factor my Packers fandom into any fantasy analysis here, and that holds true with how I regard Aaron Jones. The production has been very lackluster this season, and in particular, the volume as of late has been very alarming as well. Back in Week 10 against Russell Wilson, we were just talking Seahawks here, Aaron Jones is playing in his final game, so Russell Wilson's returned before he was or where he did sustain an MCL injury that caused him to miss just 1 week against the Minnesota Vikings in Week 11. I'll give you guys kind of a short and brief timeline here. Then in Week 12, he returns against the Rams, so a very quick recovery for Jones to get him back out there on the field after having that minorly sprained MCL. He comes back, has a mere 10 rushes for 23 yards against the Rams, heading into a Week 13 bye. My expectation, my hope, my optimism told me, all right, he was able to return extra fast. He came back in just 1 week, hits the bye week, gets a week off. I'm thinking that the 2 weeks of preparation leading up to Sunday Night Football against the Chicago Bears will lead him in a direction to be close to, if not at 100% health, back to his original level of involvement in this offense. We should be golden going forward. With that, noting that I have also factored in A.J. Dillon's workload to have increased significantly for this Packers offense. Jones came out and had a very productive outing against the Bears. If you watched that game or had him on your fantasy roster, at face value, those points look fantastic. He had 19-plus points in half PPR scoring, even more than that if you're playing full PPR leagues. That's all fine. That's all great. He had just 8 touches. That's the red flag to me. That's the thing that screams, you're not getting a safe floor here. You're not getting dependability with Aaron Jones. He had just 65 yards from scrimmage. Now, that's actually quite impressive, and the clip that averages out to on just 8 touches is rather encouraging. But 2 touchdowns in that game, 1 rushing and 1 receiving, accounted for 61.5% of his total fantasy output in that game. So you're looking at a very touchdown-dependent play here and a player whose volume has majorly decreased since the first half of this NFL season. Since Aaron Jones sustained his Week 10 MCL injury against the Seattle Seahawks, A.J. Dillon has touched the football 80 times. That averages out to 20 touches per game in the 4 games since that point in time, while Aaron Jones hasn't ran the football more than 15 times since back in Week 8 when they played the Arizona Cardinals on a short week. So the volume has majorly declined here. You're looking at a player who is increasingly touchdown dependent. Bad news for Aaron Jones owners. I'm sorry to bring it to you, but that's just what the current situation is right now. Ezekiel Elliott, another first-round pick running back from draft season this year that isn't quite living up to expectations right now. Zeke has 10.5 points or fewer in 5 of his last 7 games. Again, half PPR scoring. His average yards per rushing attempt has also declined over the second half of the season. And this is a result of a player who is just not 100% healthy right now, a player who is not seeing as much workhorse volume as we would like to see from him. You're seeing Tony Pollard, who is injured right now, factored into this offense a significant amount. And even in a game this past weekend against the Washington football team, we saw a lot more of Corey Clement than I expected us to see with Tony Pollard out of the lineup. And he took a lot of, or I shouldn't say a lot of, but more snaps in critical situations of that game as it actually became rather close down the stretch than I ever would have expected seeing. And the broadcast actually panned over to Ezekiel Elliott with his helmet off on the sideline watching from afar. So that's not what you want to see as a fantasy owner. You want to see your running back in the most pivotal points of the game in the offense and ready to make a play potentially to benefit both your fantasy team and his NFL team. So you're talking about a player who hasn't touched the ball 20 or more times on the ground since Week 5 against the Giants. Again, that goes back to the concern with volume. He isn't touching the ball, or carrying the football rather, at as high of a rate as he was in the first third of this year. And you're talking about a player who hasn't had 100 scrimmage yards in a game since Week 6 at New England. So a lot not to like here. His best ball of the season was played early on in 2021. I'm hoping he can turn things around because, of course, I root for all players every single week, and I hope that they can put up points and have good levels of output. But the trends have been rather on the downside of things and have given me reason to be a little bit pessimistic when it comes to Zeke's production down the stretch. And then finally, Chuba Hubbard here. This is one, poor Chuba, the rookie out of Oklahoma State. Not exactly a star player, but someone who I am grossly avoiding down the stretch of this season. I have no use for Chuba Hubbard in my fantasy lineups the rest of the way this year unless you are in the deepest of deep fantasy leagues. And unfortunately for Chuba, it's just because he has a brutal playoff schedule and he is not the caliber of player that Christian McCaffrey is. The lineup for the Panthers down the stretch is at Buffalo this week, Tampa Bay, New Orleans, and then Tampa Bay again. Whatever week your playoffs end, whatever week they begin, you're getting a disgusting matchup for a player that doesn't have some of the assets and benefits that Christian McCaffrey has as a skilled playmaker for this offense. If Christian McCaffrey were the running back for this team right now, I would have my concerns. I would have my questions as to how high of a floor or how high of a ceiling does he actually possess when entering into a weekly matchup. Chuba, on the other hand, is nothing close and isn't even in the same universe as Christian McCaffrey when it relates to pass catching ability. Chuba's actually had some stone hands this year, dropped some very easy passes, and been relatively unproductive in that phase of things. He had no targets this week against the Falcons. The week prior to that, the last time they played in Week 12 against the Dolphins, he had just one target, was not able to haul that in. You're looking at some significant limitations that are not a part of Christian McCaffrey's game that are a part of Chuba Hubbard. So you give me those 4 brutal matchups. This is the worst schedule for fantasy running backs down the stretch of this season. Chuba is someone that I have, again, major concerns with both. I think his ceiling is incredibly low and the floor isn't all that great either. Amir Abdullah is also somewhat of a factor, and he is more of the pass catcher for this team, although they don't have someone that really excels in that phase of things. Chuba had just 10 rushes, 33 yards, and a touchdown against the Falcons this week. Had he not scored that touchdown, it would have been a very low producing game for him, and it would have been leaving a lot of us with a lot more to be desired, and even that output might have been a bit disappointing to some managers. So Chuba's best games as the Carolina reserve running back, the fill-in for CMC, are now behind him. It's a brutal, rough road ahead, and this is someone I would not want as a RB2 or even a flex in my lineup in a lot of situations the rest of the way. Alrighty, those are my 5 players that I'm beginning to panic on as we get down the stretch of this season into the meat of the fantasy football playoffs for the 2021 year. I'm wishing you guys luck this week. If you have questions, put those down in the comment section below, and go make sure to go check out some of the other videos we put out for Week 15 action. I've also got 5 players who are our fantasy stars right now playing their best football down the stretch of this season that could be difference makers in your league in a positive manner, as well as our waiver wire ads for this week, which if you're watching this on Tuesday morning, the day after I posted that video, you still got some time before those waiver moves process. So go check out those 2 episodes, and I'll see you guys there. Peace out.